Talk about all this is St. Louis Mayor Francis Slay. Mr. Mayor, good to see you again. Thank you for coming in.
I'm pleased to be here.
Tell me about the earnings tax. You said before that you really don't like it, and it's sort of like Winston Churchill's formulation that democracy is the worst of all possible governments except for all the others. You know, this thing stinks, but there's no other way to replace it with. How important is the earnings tax to the functioning of the city, and is it that big of a chunk of the city's budget?
It's a huge chunk of the city's budget. Without the earnings tax, it would devastate the city of St. Louis. $140 million. We do have about a $580 million general operating budget, but particularly in these economic times, we cannot do without the earnings tax unless there is an acceptable plan to replace it. We don't have one now. We will not have one before April.
That's one thing I wanted to get at. A lot of observers believe that this is disingenuous of the opponents of the earnings tax to put this on the ballot and then blithely say, we have nothing to replace it with, you know, maybe this or maybe that. And none of the economists to whom I've spoken have a plan with anything like certainty that this could be replaced with. Do you know of anybody who's even blue-skied anything that if the earnings tax went away, what could it be replaced with to raise that money?
There has been a study that was done. Rex Singfield did fund a study to put together some suggestions on what could replace the earnings tax and what cost savings and other things could happen to replace the earnings tax. And that's all and good, but the fact is, in order to implement some of these things, we'd have to get, of course, public input and debate. We'd have to get the state legislature to vote for some of these things, and the Board of Aldermen to vote for some of these things, and the voters of St. Louis to vote on these things. All of this would take a tremendous amount of time, I think at least a couple of years before we come up with a solid plan in order to, assuming we could come up with something, in order to replace it. April is way too soon. We do not have a plan. We will not have one by April, and we cannot lose the earnings tax unless and until there is an acceptable, and I want to accentuate acceptable plan in order to replace it, and one that has to be approved by the public.
Now, you mentioned Rex Singfield, the retired libertarian millionaire and investment broker who's given money to all sorts of campaigns, including yours, campaigns all over the state. He is the money behind this, thinking that earnings tax, in theory, is a bad idea. Now, having said that Rex Singfield has done a lot of good things for the city, from the chess club to numerous other enterprises, doesn't this seem to be one private individual spending his wealth destructively if the impact of losing this earnings tax is as bad as you say it would be?
Well, it would be destructive if we get a bad result in April. I know that, and I've talked to Rex at length about this issue, we disagree on the approach on this issue. I don't think we're ready to, submit it to the voters in April on this issue, but it is where it is. I mean, he's going to do what he wants to do and what he believes is in the best interest. He believes in the best interest of the St. Louis region. He believes that the earnings tax is a disincentive to business, and in that regard, I don't disagree. I think he believes it's a bigger disincentive than I do. And I'm not trying to speak on his behalf, but he believes it's a bigger disincentive than I do. But the fact is here that what's going to happen that gives me some comfort is that the people of St. Louis, ultimately, the people of St. Louis will make the decision on this, not people outstate. On April, there will be a ballot measure that I'm sure Proposition A will pass. It's drafted in a way that almost assures its passage. That means in November. That means in April, the people of St. Louis by themselves will decide whether or not the earnings tax should continue. I believe if they are informed, they will vote. They will vote. A majority of people in St. Louis will vote to keep the earnings tax. And that's going to be our challenge, and I will lead the effort to help make that happen.
But under this ballot initiative, the citizens of St. Louis would have to go through this every 5 years.
That's right.
The city of St. Louis would have to hold an election every 5 years on the earnings tax.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. Now, again, the ballot language was written by the opponents of the earnings tax that of course, I was not involved in at all. This was put on the ballot. If it passes, I mean, they certainly have that right to do that. They can go out and spend all the money they want under the law, get the signatures, get it on the ballot. So the ballot is what it is, and we have to deal with it. And I think that the best approach is to rally our forces and to focus on the voters of St. Louis on the April ballot, to inform them what this would mean for the city, and let them know that we cannot get rid of the earnings tax unless and until we have a replacement, and certainly by April we will not. Now, we'll go back on the ballot, assuming the voters say, yes, we want to continue the earnings tax, it'll go back in 5 years. Within that period of time, there are a lot of options. one of which is to, keep fighting this thing. Another is to see if we can find some ways to whittle it down, and there are some other options as well we're exploring.
In terms of this November's vote, though, this is a statewide vote, and my question to you would be, what business do the citizens of the rest of the state of Missouri have on voting on taxation policy in the city of St. Louis? I mean, it's not like the voters of the city of St. Louis vote on the taxes Potosi can put into effect. How can this possibly work when the entire state votes on the earnings tax that affects the city of St. Louis?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. There's the argument that people outstate shouldn't be meddling in our business, and I agree with that. But basically what this does is just asks the voters, and I wish it was different. I wish this wasn't on the ballot at this time as well. But the fact is that it asks the people whether or not they want to vote on it. In other words, if you have an earnings tax, do you want to be able to vote on this? And at least, the November ballot aside, in April, which is the one that really has meaning for St. Louis, do you want to keep the earnings tax, or you don't want to keep the earnings tax? Outstate people are not going to be voting on the April ballot. They'll just be people of St. Louis. So that gives me some comfort. Having said that, we have a lot of explaining to do. We need to explain to the voters what this would mean to the city and why they need to vote to continue a tax that the city relies on so heavily.
Final quick question, following up on that, but it still begs the issue. Yes, you're going to concentrate on the April vote, but at the end of the day, what business is it of the citizens of Columbia or Sikeston or Moberly what taxes the city of St. Louis implements?
I don't think they have any business doing it. And I fight on this one all the time when you talk about local control of the police department, issues that deal with our employee residency.